This video covers the topic of federalism, which is an important part of Section 1 of the A-level syllabus. Federalism is right at the heart of the constitutional settlement of 1787, which created the United States of America. There are different stages in the history of federalism, i.e. the relationship between states and the central government over the course of American history. And federalism, compared to the UK, is not covered in a great detail in this video. But remember that in the UK, it's a unitary country to compare with federal. Everything really is quite centralised in Westminster, but it's gone a bit further towards federalism over the last few decades in both directions, both in the devolution of power to Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, but especially Scotland, and in its ever closer union with Europe until recently. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. Very impressive start to the Constitution, and although odd grammar, more perfect sums up both how great the Americans thought their new nation was, but also the need that they had to have a rule book called the Constitution, particularly to navigate the difficult relationship between the claims of independent states and the need for the new nation to bind together. They hadn't got it right previously with the Articles of Confederation, which were too loose to allow the nation to really pull together, so they wanted something more. Madison and Hamilton in particular were the Federalists, and they wanted a constitution that gave lots of power to the centre. They were opposed by the anti-federalist, and the constitution was a bit of a compromise, although the main body of the constitution pretty much reflects what Madison wanted, but that's counteracted by the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, which more than anything else is a reassertion of states' rights right at the foundation of the United States. The definition of federalism is where political power is divided between a national government, the centre, also known as the federal government, or Washington DC when we're talking about America, and local governments, the states in the United States, California, New York and so forth, each having their own area of substantive jurisdiction, that is jurisdiction that is meaningful. States' rights is a huge debate even now, and we'll see it come up quite a lot in this topic. Those who believe in states' rights defend the powers and independence and the rights of individual states, and don't like to see the federal government having too much power. Their argument stems from a belief that that is historically true to the great American dream, that individual states choosing democratically their own path is a very American thing, and the federal government should be very limited in how it takes power from the localities, and that's very undemocratic, and it's the sign of the elites pushing around a little guy. But in every important way, in feel and in philosophical and ideological tenet, people who believe that the government shouldn't be there and the individual should do what they want, libertarians and many in the Tea Party and the Republican right, see as a kind of proxy war for the battle for individual rights, the battle for individual states to have more power and the federal government have less power. And there's the argument about states' rights is very much at the heart of the culture wars in America, this very deep partisan battle between those sort of globalist, modern um, activist, northern Democrat identifying people in America, and those more likely, in contrast, to be Trump voters, particularly from southern states. And there's probably misspelled here, but unresolved Civil War issues, or if you'd like to put it even more bluntly, this clash between city and country, between north and south, between rich and poor, between sort of citizens of nowhere and those very rooted in their state, has been bubbling along for all of American history. The Civil War was a great spillover of that, and it continues to be part of the debate. Now, the Constitution deals with the relationship and the relative powers of the central government and the states in three ways, really. The first way is the enumerated powers. Those are the ones that are literally numbered or bullet points in the Constitution that state in black and white which are powers for the states and which are powers for the central government. Next are the concurrent powers, which are a little bit difficult to understand because the Constitution gives these powers both to the individual states and to the central government, which of course can cause some confusion and make interpretation by the Supreme Court very, very difficult. And finally, there are implied powers, and these are powers that the federal government has seized on a loose reading of the Constitution, sometimes backed up by activist and loose constructionist Supreme Courts who are happy to give these powers to the federal government. Most notably, a lot of these powers have been allowed through the Elastic Clause, which has been, and the Commerce Clause, much used. The 10th Amendment, on the other hand, in the Bill of Rights, it's been less useful, particularly since the Supreme Court case US v. Darby, 1941, but that does state that if it's not enumerated, it's a power for the states. The enumerated powers of Congress, and therefore the federal government, include several very uncontroversial ones, such as to support armies, coin money, establish post offices. But here we can see in the enumerated powers the two clauses, the Commerce Clause and the Elastic Clause, which give rise to the federal government being able to claim lots of implied powers. The other clause, which is very, very important in terms of federal government, is the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Section 2 of the Constitution. And it says that all federal laws and treaties made under the authority of the government are superior to state laws, and that the Supreme Court and the US Constitution is superior to the constitutions of the individual states and the individual states' Supreme Courts. If you couple this with the power that the Supreme Court has seized and the areas that it now views as justiciable, in other words, things that it can make the judgment on because they can be argued in a courtroom, you can see how this clause has given much power to central government. You can see here in more detail the implied powers that come from Article 1, Section 8. Provide for the common defence and general welfare of the United States has been used to justify plenty of power by federal government. But more than anything else, the Commerce Clause has been used by the federal government to claim that it has the power over quite a lot of domestic policy, because quite a lot of domestic policy affects the economy, and if it's affecting the economy, it's affecting commerce among the several states. An example is Gonzalez versus Reich, 2005, which established that even if states made marijuana legal, the federal government could still arrest and maintain the illegality of marijuana. Another great example is South Dakota versus Dole, and finally McCulloch v. Maryland. In McCulloch v. Maryland, the central government set up a bank which the state of Maryland didn't really want, and so started to tax, and Maryland was defeated. And anything not justified by the Commerce Clause or the Supremacy Clause or the General Welfare Clause can be argued to be justified in terms of federal power through the Elastic Clause, whereby the federal government can argue that it's necessary and proper to pass a law or to take an executive action in order that one of its enumerated powers can be carried out properly. This, alongside the Commerce Clause, was used by Obama to justify the compulsory nature of the individual mandate in Obamacare, and in the very important case, National Federation of Independent Businesses versus Sebelius 2012, the Supreme Court actually said, no, Obamacare can't be justified with these, but anyway, it can be justified as a tax. So a little bit of a fudge from the Supreme Court there, but just an example, a recent, very important example of why and how the Supreme Court has to judge the nature of federal versus state power. Concurrent powers are simultaneously exercised at state level and at federal level. The best example of concurrent powers is the Election Clause in Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, which says the times, places and manner of holding elections will be prescribed in each state by the legislature of that state. So far so clear, enumerated for the states, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, which is very confusing. The key test case on this clause is Arizona versus the Intertribal Council of Arizona of 2013, which revolved around Arizona's unique voter registration requirements, including the necessity of providing documentary proof of citizenship. In the 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court held that Arizona's registration requirements were unlawful because they are preempted by federal voting laws. In other words, it held that the Voter Registration Act of 1965, which said that you couldn't have tricky and difficult arrangements for people to register to vote, because those tricky and difficult voter registration arrangements were used by racist states to prevent non-white people from voting, that couldn't be law, and the federal government had the right under this clause to make that decision. So what have we seen with federalism in the Constitution? The Constitution is set up and established by Hamilton and Madison to have limited government. This was more important to them than there being power at the centre or power in the states. They wanted there to be very little power exercised by the government because they wanted people generally to be free, and they feared the tyranny of government. That said, they wanted the country to be united, they wanted the nation to be strong, so they erred on the side of quite a lot of federal power, which they thought by and large would be more responsible than states. And that federalist urge has given many governments in Washington DC the excuse and opportunity to be quite activist, and activist Supreme Courts have supported that using the Commerce Clause, the Elastic Clause and so forth. But right at the start of this crucial debate, which still is important in America today, anti-federalists got a fight back in the Bill of Rights, Amendments 1 to 10, especially the 10th Amendment, which states that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. But US v. Darby, 1941, ruled that this was a mere truism, by which the Supreme Court meant that obviously the things that are not written here are written there, and didn't have much meaning, much to the irritation of people who wanted to use it to fight for the rights of states. In summary then, the enumerated powers are the powers that are written down in the Constitution and state clearly whether the power belongs to the individual state government or to the federal government. Concurrent powers are powers that are written down in the Constitution, but state not very clearly that the powers belong to both the state government and to the federal government. The implied powers are the powers that the federal government has grabbed on the basis of vague wording in the Constitution, which they take to mean that it implies that they have powers to do this, that, or the other, such as the elastic clause. And the 10th Amendment states clearly that things which are not enumerated or mentioned in the Constitution automatically default to being reserved to the states or the people, but the 10th Amendment hasn't been successfully used very much by states' rights activists to assert their authority because of the Supreme Court decision, US v. Darby. The textbook splits the history of the United States and the nature of its federalism into dual federalism, cooperative federalism, and new federalism up to about the end of the 20th century, and then just talk specifically about the Bush and Obama presidencies and the state of federalism there. Most textbooks and studies agree with the first two, but they're a little bit, new federalism is a little bit of a simplification, and in fact the last 30-40 years are a little bit more complicated than that would imply. The period between the foundation of the United States and 1920 or so is known as a period of dual federalism because they focused on very clear enumerated rights and privileges, and the state government, the federal government, the local governments all did their own thing separate to each other without clashing. It's sometimes described as a layer cake. The states had pretty strong rights to do most of the domestic policy. Federal government was very limited and didn't really interfere with people's lives and the economy so much, other than printing money, going to war, making peace. But then the economy changed. The Wall Street crash happened in 1929, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to office and took the Keynesian view that it was the job of the central government to manage the economy. So he passed things like the National Recovery Administration Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1936. And these were ruled unconstitutional at first by the Supreme Court because it was such a huge increase in federal power, an increase in federal power that Roosevelt felt was needed in order to prosecute his New Deal, and that was a big spending and public works program to cure the mass unemployment and huge economic problems. A constitutional crisis, therefore, between what the Supreme Court said and what Roosevelt felt he needed to do, and one that was resolved by Roosevelt's court packing plan. In 1937, he asked the Congress to pass a Judiciary Reorganization Bill of 1937, which would have allowed him to appoint new Supreme Court justices and all that sort of thing. This was an example of the way in which actually the Supreme Court is checked in power by the other branches, because Congress can add numbers of people to the Supreme Court. You have to remember too that Roosevelt won a landslide election in 1936, so it was pretty clear to the Supreme Court that he had the people on his side. And instead of allowing themselves to be diluted by a court packing, the Supreme Court caved in and began to vote to uphold New Deal measures. It was known as the switch in time that saved none. So the period from 1930 to about the 1960s or just 1970s was known as cooperative federalism. This is a slightly strange term because quite often this sort of cooperation was the federal government putting pressure on the state governments to do things, as well as the federal government being incredibly sort of powerful. Many Democrat presidents in that period wanted to pass lots of legislation to make people's lives better, even if that legislation might be more properly in the states. So the Health, Education and Welfare Departments were founded in 1953, Transportation Department in 1966. There was a huge increase in categorical grants, a really clear, a really important term rather, but not a very clear one, to be honest, where the federal government would give money to the states but tell them what they had to spend it on. And this period is sometimes described as marble cake federalism, because there's lots more being done both by the federal government and the state government, and by the federal government giving money to the state governments to make them do it. So it's a sort of bit of a muddle and a mix-up really, but lots and lots of government going on. By the late 60s, early 70s, President Nixon felt that the thing needed to change, particularly because the Republican presidents which dominated in this period, Nixon, Ford, Reagan and Bush, largely were in favour of states' rights in principle. So up to a point they tried to reduce the scope of the federal government, tried to cut the deficit, spend less as a federal government, and restore some power to the states. The problem, however, was that they very often didn't want to pay for it, and sometimes they did exercise a lot of federal power to make the states do things they wanted. So this is an era of unfunded mandates at times, as well as block grants. So block grants is when the federal government gives money to the states and lets them do what they want, so that restores the states' powers. But as deficits began to bite and the government in Washington didn't have enough money to spend, they kind of switched and came out with lots of unfunded mandates. It's a sort of coercive federalism in a way, which is where the federal government tells the states what to spend on but doesn't give them the money to spend, so they have to find it themselves. Why is it that federalism changes over this period? Well, one of the main reasons is the country becomes much, much larger, 50 states from the original 13. And so it's much bigger and more complicated, and frankly more important to have coordination well mapped out between the states, with a country that grows both in number of states and number of people massively. Industry advances, and there's quite a lot of increase in trade, commerce and interconnectedness of the economy as a result of this, as well as migration of labour, which argues for common standards, much as the argument we would make the UK benefits from being in a trading bloc with the EU because it's a sort of integrated European economy and therefore must have the same standards, or not, and communication revolution, of course, roads, rail, telephones, telegraph, IT, internet, all these things, as it were, shrink the size of the nation, makes everyone a little bit more homogenous. But the biggest things that cause changes in the relationship between the federal government and the states government are events, particularly major economic events like the Great Depression, or indeed problems of deficits which cause the federal government to not want to spend any money. The Second World War in Britain certainly massively increased the scope of government because there was a lot of central planning involved in being part of a total war, and that a lot of that sort of central planning and control never really disappeared after the war. Similarly, in America, and the activist Supreme Courts of the Warren and Burger courts massively increased the power of the federal government because these court decisions themselves, allowable under the supremacy clause of the Constitution, meant that the judges at the centre in Washington DC have begun to make laws which told the states what to do against their will, and it relied on the federal government to enforce those things. And the 16th Amendment and some others too have been passed which give the federal government more power. The 16th Amendment allows federal income tax levied by the government, and without that really the federal government couldn't be anything like as powerful, because in the very old days it rather relied on the states raising money for it, which of course gave the states much more power. And Westbury, a case that we discussed recently, that's Westbury v Sanders 1964, along with Baker v Carr 1962, both of which dealt with reapportionment and ensuring that congressional districts were equalised for population changes so that they were fair, delinked congressional districts from national districts, and also the arrival of direct primaries meant that no longer in that period after the 1960s did local state politics and state power have the whip hand over how congressmen were elected, and so Congress is a little bit more independent of its local parties. So what's happened more recently in this space federalism? Well, Obama, a Democrat president, the first for a little bit of time, had this agenda for change, and also was dealing with the fallout from the financial crisis. And although not a particular fan of states' rights, he did in fact funnel a huge amount of the stimulus package through the states, and therefore increased federal assistance to the states for them to spend quite greatly. Some of the state governors were so Republican and states' right that they tried to refuse the money that Obama sent. And he also reauthorized SCHIP, Medicaid expansion, and the Race to the Top program. All these programs which he encouraged the states to run, but gave them a lot of money. All these, in a way, were federal power, but in a way were also a great help to the states and gave them the money they wanted to do more. But Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act of 2010, was a huge blow to those people who thought that states should be able to decide things like what kind of healthcare their people had. You see, with things that are more liberal in terms of domestic policy, such as pollution permits for business in California, or the legalization of cannabis for recreational use in Colorado, were things that Obama let happen. So you see in this period really the sort of 21st century politics really becoming more partisan. So broadly speaking, the Republicans are all in favour of states' rights, except for when the states do things they don't like handgun bans, in which case they seem quite happy for the Supreme Court to pass decisions like DC v. Heller. And similarly, Democrat presidents are all in favour of strong federal government and lots of national programs to help people, but are quite happy to return power to the states as long as the states are doing the sort of things that they like. Federalism is the huge framework and theoretical part of this north-south divide, of this tension in the United States political system between very different cultures and histories. This didn't map so much onto party politics in the old days because particularly the Blue Dog Democrats, Southern voters supporting Democrats candidates because that's what they did during the Civil War, meant that there was a considerable degree of right-wing Southern states' rights people in the Democrat Party, which allowed for a little bit of bipartisanship and for Congress to have a myriad of views. But in many ways recently, the country has become more and more polarized in opinion, and broadly speaking, some states are very Republican, very Tea Party, and some states are very left-wing, and the federal government tends to support states' rights only when it suits its political persuasion. The biggest debates about federalism of recent years were over Obamacare, because many governors in many states would wanted to refuse to enact this policy. So many of the advantages of federalism are around the way that it allows a very difficult and complicated society that's very diverse to operate efficiently, that it allows lots of different access to points to government for people, lots of elections, lots of different levels of government, so people can have more of a say, which is sort of pluralism. That by splitting the power of the government between the states and the federal government, that effectively means that individual rights are protected. There's a lovely argument that states can be policy labs, that they can try out things, and if they're successful, the federal government can take them up. And it's true that Massachusetts, for example, had sort of state healthcare, rather like Obamacare, and was used as a model. But very often in this polarized era, what that means is that Democrat states seem to pass laws which are even more Democrat and quite extremely liberal, and Republican red states pass laws or are very strict on immigration or something, which is pretty reactionary. Large countries like the United States, large by geography and population, really do need a federal system, although I suppose information technology makes that less than likely. It is hard to make law in America. On the other side of the argument, it frustrates the national will, having federalism, because there's so many layers of government. Just another source of gridlock, another source of conflict, and another costly bureaucratic system. If you ask anyone what they'd like more of in the world, there won't be very many that say politicians. The UK, as we discussed, does not have a federal system of government, although devolution has made it a little bit more so. So where have we got to? We've got to a situation where the 21st century is one where it's hard to describe federalism. Clearly, there are certainly many presidents of the of recent times who have thought in theory it'd be good to return power to the states, but they found it very difficult to resist actually governing and asking Congress to pass legislation that forces the states to bend to their will. We've seen, I think, a real change that has increased tremendously over the last 20, 30 years, but especially recently, of massive distrust of government generally. This has been a boost to states' rights because people tend to trust local politicians more than they trust national politicians, who they see as a distant elite that's not listening. And we see that economic and technological change has led to a much larger scope for government at the federal level, but you never really see bureaucrats who have power giving that power away. So there's been more government at the centre. That doesn't necessarily mean there's been less at the state level, and yet there's been an increasing distrust in government. So you both have big government in America and a country that hates big government, which is not really the recipe for a happy polity. On that depressing tone, I wish you all the best with this topic.